Vervaeke.
Hello, Jacob. Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you on. A man possessed by the search for wisdom, it seems, at times.
Yeah, that's very much. Insofar as we are possessed by love, yeah, I think so. Yes, that would be a fair way of putting it.
I was watching, so I've been, following your Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, which is just amazing in terms of breadth, just the amount of books that are channeling through your brain and body. But obviously been a sort of student of the Dialogos conversations that you've been having this year with people like Jordan and Guy, and just Chris, of course, and Andrew Taggart and Johannes and the wider network of people, which, by the way, just sort of appreciate the way that you're always kind of giving recognition to all of the people's work that's going into what you're doing.
I think that's important to do. I think it's very important to do.
Yeah, it's really, there's a sense of like when John is articulating John's point, you're actually getting like a map of the whole sort of terrain of things which have come into it.
Yeah, and to thank you for saying that, and also to give recognition to the distributed cognition that's actually at work, and I'm really trying to exemplify, even when I'm speaking monologically, I want to try to emphasize that deep reason, deep reflection, deep insight, deep questioning are ultimately all dialogical in nature. I'm trying to, in many ways, in many manner, right, trying to break out of this, this monolithic, monistic mind. We have this picture of the mind as this completely self-enclosed, self-discoursing, like all of that completely self-enclosed understanding of who and what our meaning making is and what the mind is. And this is also, like I mentioned in many places, you've probably seen, this is very much in consonance with a movement within cognitive science called 4E cognitive science, which is to try and not see the mind as something I possess in my head, but something that I participate in between my brain and my body and my embodied brain and the world, right? And so there's a deep connection between that model of the mind that is emerging in cognitive science, which I think is fundamentally on the right track, and the ancient ideas that reason and reflection, insight, aspiration, all these things are inherently dialogical in nature. So not only do I feel there's a moral point, which is significant and important, to sharing credit, I want to point to distributed cognition, and I want to point to dialogical rationality and try to exemplify them as much as possible so that people can see, not just hear what I'm referring to, but they can see it exemplified in how I'm trying to practice it before them. So it's actually very important to me. It's right practice for me in a deep sense. It's part of my spiritual practice to try and do that more and more and more.
It seems like it's a kind of it's like a meta relationship that's being represented that kind of goes up and down all of the levels of the stack of being. It's kind of like the relationship with world is dialogic, and then within that, there's the intertextuality. Sorry, I'm getting stupid email notifications.
That's okay.
Trying to figure out how to turn those off. It's in relationship with world, and then within self, a dialogue between all of the things that are coming from world, mother and father and philosophers and everything.
I think that's really important. That affords me an opportunity to balance things out a little bit, because for obvious reasons, I've been emphasizing the what Christopher Master Pietro and I call the horizontal aspects of dialectic. Dialectic is the psychotechnology that scaffolds you into the process of dialogos, right? It's like a set of directions to direct your attention and the way you're coupling to the world, so that dialogos can be afforded. But one of the directions of dialectic is the horizontal. It's the interpersonal one, and that's the one that I get to practice with Guy and Jordan and Chris and Andrew Sweeney, etc. Zach Stein. But what you just mentioned is also right, and this was integral to Plato, the Platonic model, right? There's also what you might call the vertical, that intra-ontological, that you have to sort of practice individually. Stephen Batchelor says we're always alone with others, which I think is the title of one of his books, which is a great way of putting it. But this, as you said, how you remember what Plato does in the Republic, where the model of the justice in the city is reflected in the model of in the justice between the elements of the psyche, and vice versa, and they mutually afford and conform to each other. So it's exactly that inner dialogos and that outer dialogos are actually just like the left and right fields of vision that you see through into depth perception. You're always looking through them to what grounds the two of them together, and that's when that starts to happen. That's when you really get a sense of dialogos. And so part of what I'm going to do in the next series after Socrates is I'm going to talk a lot about the horizontal, because you've seen a lot of the work I've been doing with a lot of people that I owe a lot to. But I'll also be bringing out that vertical and then showing how they're integrated together. So that's very exciting for me, because when those two resonate with each other, you get to a place that is a field, a grounding, an affording of profound transformation.
Feel a lot of pathways opening up just as you're saying all of that. Things that I've been kind of thinking about recently. I mean, first and foremost, there's something about the way in which the mystic or the wisdom teacher or the religious prophet very often is speaking in relationship to the environment, very often kind of using metaphors derived from nature or speaking in parable. And I think there's some relationship between this and the way in which our cognition takes place outside of our bodies in relationship to the aesthetic of the environment.
Yeah, Jacob, I think that's a very astute observation. There is, I think, a deep continuity, and that's a phrase that my friend and colleague Evan Thompson has introduced into 4E-Cogs. But I think there's a deep continuity between the ineffable and enacted mystery of everyday cognition, and the ineffable and enacted mystery of some of our most ultimate experiences. And I'm working on a book with Daniel Gregg on this called The Cognitive Continuum from Insight to Enlightenment, that the machinery that you're using, as I mentioned, I'm reading this book right now by Esther Lightcap Meek, Longing to Know. It was recommended to me. And she's actually making a very convergent argument. It's convergent because both she and I are deeply influenced by the work of Michael Polanyi. But there's a deep continuity. I want to use her example because let me just use it as an analogy. So she talks about, because it's very similar to some of the ones I use, but it's a new one. So I don't know if you've seen it. There's these called magic eye pictures. And there's a bunch of colored dots, and you sort of move the picture, you do the zoom in, out, optimal gripping, and then what'll happen is it'll suddenly snap. You'll get this aha, you'll get an insight experience, and suddenly you'll see a three-dimensional dolphin leaping out of the water, and it just sort of catches, right? And she talks about how, like, you go from looking at, you'll recognize some of this language, to looking through. You go from sort of seeing all the dots to seeing the dolphin seeing a deeper dimension. And the point is, that's just an extraordinary example of something we're doing moment to moment. You're doing it right now. You're taking all the pixels on your screen, right, and the complicated, subtle motions of changes in variance and color and hue of my face, and you're making a face. And then you're looking through that face into my mind and into my thoughts. And you're doing it like that. And if I ask you, how do you do it? How do you get that depth, that ontological depth perception? You'll go, well, I don't know. And it has an aspect of insight and revelation. And you have to sort of, entrust yourself to an embodied process and a skillful way of coupling to the world. And then she's making the argument, and she's a theist, and that's where I differ from her, but she says that's similar to how we see God, right? And what I think she's meaning is that there's a deep continuity between our most mystical experiences and our most everyday experience, because our everyday experience contains some of that mystery that become more aware of when it is mystery that's embedded within an awe experience. So I think there is, in fact, I think what you're saying there is exactly right. I think it's not just that the wisdom teachers or mystics are, using metaphor. I think they're actually affording a realization of the continuity between your everyday experience and your ultimate experiences. I mean, this is captured in Zen, right? The famous Zen parable. Before I did Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. While I was doing Zen, mountains weren't mountains and rivers weren't rivers. And then when I was done doing Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. Notice how I have to use my intonation to convey the difference, right? And so it's very important. And I'm sorry, I'm talking a while, but this is a crucial point. This sense of deep continuity is an alternative way of relating the transcendent to the immanent that breaks away from sort of the two worlds mythology that has tended to build an inaccessible fortress of mystique around the transcendent, and then make it very easily translatable into the absurd, impossible that can just be ignored, right? But if I make you realize that that ultimate is awe-inspiring, and it is due of reverence. I'm not denying that. But if I make you realize that has a deep continuity with how you're seeing my face, then you can't dismiss it or ignore it as an absurd impossibility. And so I want to try and break out of the two worlds mythology, and the one that builds the spiritual as this, as this thing that is fortified by supernaturalistic mystique. And so that's why I got very excited by what you said, because it's an insight, right, that points to an alternative way, an alternative grammar of thinking about what these teachers have said to us that can perhaps remove it from a two worlds mythology in which it has been encrusted.
Love what you're saying, John.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really nice. I love just like throwing the piece out and then watching you do a little transformation on it, and then it's kind of more exalted. I'm in Athens right now, and I have been for the last 3 months. So I was staying with my parents for quarantine.
You're in Athens, Greece?
Yes.
Wow. That's a nice place.
Yeah, it's been probably more positive than a few people's quarantine. Difficult at times, of course. But one of the things I've been doing is spending a lot of time in Greek Orthodox churches, just sort of observing the church from a different, I grew up with the Anglican church, but one of the things you note in there is, I'm kind of sitting in presence and observing the space and observing the icons and so forth. The first thing is you see the difference with the way that the people, the Greek cultural relationship with it, they don't really look around and look up in the way that I'm doing. They kind of just shuffle in, go straight to the icon at the front and kiss the icon. And there's kind of a very like private, slightly imbued with shame kind of a feeling thing going on. And the aesthetic of the churches, and I'm definitely a sort of believer in the need to build transcendent environments, but it always has this feeling of like just being on the cusp of something, but you can't quite get it. You know, it's like beautiful and golden, and the eye of Horus is up there somewhere looking out at you, but it's a doorway and a little railing, and then behind that maybe a curtain, and behind that something else, and then you go out in the street, and then you can actually find the real deal, hopefully. And I think when you get closer to the real deal, you almost have to afford space for the real deal to reveal itself. So I've been having, you know, a lot of my inquiry has really just been paying very close attention to phenomena as they're arising. And so I'll kind of see like, I've started noticing very briefly, there's moments in which something appears in my field, which I later realized is a cyclist. But for a moment, my brain hasn't quite figured out what it is. And so it's this amorphous, liminal thing. And the curious part about that is the quality of what you experience when it's in the liminal, not formed space is very set and setting, really. It's kind of what you are bringing to it as much as anything. I just want to build out one more sort of piece for you. I was watching your dialogue with Jordan Peterson from years ago, like 5 years ago. And by the way,
I wish we could have another.
Well, I think what was really shining out for me was partly this kind of journey from like the IDW to what you're doing, and how what you're doing is so much more bringing out that like collaborative, dialogic, and, you know, like figuring out how to really like achieve intimacy, and, you know, the basic interpersonal stuff is actually happening. But with Jordan, one of the things that you agreed on was that the meaning crisis, which can be both, you know, the perennial, continual crisis of being, but the very specific historical trajectory of meaning crisis has different inflection points. And you can go back to World War II, you can go back to the time of Nietzsche, you can go back to Descartes, you can go back to man's breakage with the natural world. And so what I like to do now is present a piece which has kind of just been in my head and esoteric, and see if we can bring it in. And it's a notion of, I've called it like the landscape of trauma. And what it is an inquiry into the nature of trauma, which is revealing of a lot of these kind of elements of reality that you speak to. The sort of inexplicability of people with past traumas finding other people in the world and coming into relationship with them, neither of them being conscious of it, and this kind of being a invisible but meaningful like attractor and force. And the way in which trauma is stored in the body as a really embodied property of being, as a kind of disconnection from aspects of self, it seems to me super tied up with embodied cognition. And
it is.
Jordan kept on talking about, like, you know, bringing order as like a way of kind of narrowing in the bounds of chaos. And for me, like, I can see a way in which there's a landscape of trauma which we are the embodied inheritors of. and our coming back into relationship with spirituality and nature is really like a going down and into and releasing all of those, like, you know, traumas of the 20th century alone are enormous. You know,
Yeah.
My grandfather was in the Second World War. His father was in the First World War. Before that, they lived under awful Victorian English culture, and, you know, and then we can go all the way back to how is it that they became so alienated from nature in the first place. So yeah, I wanted to kind of to hear how you might play with that notion.
Well, you throw three things that, and I don't think they're happenstance. And it's interesting how there's often a gathering of things together beyond sort of our egocentric awareness of how they're gathered together. So you brought up Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and then you talked about sort of the liminal place where where sense making is, you can get a more direct phenomenological awareness of it, and how set and setting matter. And then you moved into the fact that responding to the meaning crisis, and this is something I need to talk more about. I'm going to talk more about, and this is, you know, the work of Levine and others about dealing with trauma, and both collective and individual trauma, and the way in which trauma gets embodied in individuals and the way it gets embedded into social systems. And so why do I think all of those relate to each other? Well, first of all, it's interesting that Neoplatonism actually, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, I should put it, and the person to talk to about this, of course, Jonathan Pajot. Jonathan's a colleague of mine, and we have a very good relationship. I got to meet him once in person, and I really, really respect what he has to say. And he's very much a proponent of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. But one of the things that's clear in Eastern Orthodox Christianity is the way it brings the Neoplatonic project that we were talking about earlier, the vertical and the horizontal, of trying to refine and clarify intelligibility so as to enhance ontological depth perception, and to do the anagoge, do the ascent, right? But that Neoplatonic element, which is very present in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, has been integrated with aspects of Christianity that have to do with exactly what you're talking about, which have to do with trauma. Salvation ultimately means healing, and the healing that's being dealt with there is the sense that we are, in some sense, broken, bent, damaged, and that that is something that has to be addressed in an embodied fashion. This is part of the mythology of the incarnation. The Logos has to be embodied in order to not only bring us the intelligibility of the Logos, but to confront the trauma that we embody as people. And so that's being brought together in the Neoplatonic Christianity, the healing, the trauma, but also the ascent of intelligibility, the Logos and the healing. The Logos and the salvation come together in the incarnation, which is an ancient word for embodiment, right? And then the point that puts you liminal, that puts you into, right, the place, right? The place where the icon actually sits. The icon sits, and you already referenced it. It's something that you can see, but it's just beyond your grasp. And that's a liminal, like the liminality that you're describing phenomenologically. You can see it, but you can't quite see through it. You can see it, but you can't quite see what it means. And you're on that space of trying to actively make sense. And notice how all these are circling around each other in a very sort of pregnant fashion. And they're sort of bouncing off each other and connecting and coupling, attracting to each other and affording each other, articulating each other. And I don't think that's coincidence. I think that we need to deal deeply with the integration of those three, which is the right? And think about the virtues that are needed for each, perhaps, as a way of thinking about it. So intelligibility requires, right, the practice of the dialectic, and right, what that would demand from us. But that has at its heart a kind of receptivity to the anomalous, to the liminal, to the not yet, so that I can move beyond where I am. But that receptivity is enmeshed, is bound up inseparably with dealing in the ways in which I am closed off from receptivity because of trauma. And that if I can't release, if I can't open myself up beyond that, Michael Washburn calls it body armor, which I think is a wonderful way of putting it. If I can't learn to become aware of it and let it go, which is not something you can pretty much, it's not something you can do on your own in an autodidactic fashion. You need other people in a very sort of profound way, which is why, of course, you also find yourself going into the ecclesia, going into the church, right, or going into the Sangha. So I think that again, it's interesting how I can see Heraclitus said, "Don't listen to me, but listen to the logos in my speech." Mm-hmm. So through your speech, I can sense a logos in the way in how these things are coming together, and what we're doing hopefully together is realizing how they belong together and what they're pointing us towards. They're pointing us towards the deep intercreation between anagoge, an enhancement of ontological depth perception, a courage and a willingness to move into the liminal and the anomalous and relate to it as something of wonder, but that cannot be undertaken without, it is necessarily bound up with the healing of the trauma that blocks our appropriate receptivity, and that is something that has to happen dialogically. This is again where I think we need something like a religion that's not a religion, and not just an ideology, and not just a personal belief system, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I would respond to what you said.
It's incredibly astute, John. Very, you've seen through the ruse of my language into what sort of is holding me captive right now. No, that's a poor way to put it. But I was telling you a little bit before that my big inquiry, the piece that I'm sort of most bringing to this discourse is from an understanding of Islam and Islam's relationship to the West. Yeah. But now I find myself almost kind of stepping back a little bit from that inquiry, and I'm trying to figure out the Jesus piece, the thing, both. Which is, it's salient incredibly to what you're saying, because I grew up in a Christian context, imbued with real faith. The use of the name of Jesus was sort of just all over my early childhood, and was in a community context until the age of 10 or 11. So for me, a big part of passing it all out has been sort of, I think for most people, the worst thing about Christianity or the Christ lineage is Christians and the church. And my father was a kind of religious man who spent a long time banging his head against the walls of the culture and institutions of the church. So I guess what it feels to me is that so much of the Christianity that I came from there was a celebration of arrival. It's like we are broken and we have arrived, but have we yet done the requisite work and drawn upon the vast array of resources available to us in order to enable that? No. What we're doing is really constraining ourselves in very limited bands of thinking. And I've been sort of dialoguing a little bit with some people on various journeys. Like some are still Christian, some are kind of moving out of it into something else. And this feeling of like the way that their like cognitive grammar is constrained by reference to things that they already know, and the presupposition that that the answers are already there. And for me, so much of this has been like, I took it's super resonant with your path from what I know, in the sense that I kind of went atheist, went agnostic, and then went by a completely different route to arrive at some sense of spirituality and relationship to mystery and contemplative practices and all of this stuff. Like all of that has occurred for me up until this point without any reference to Christianity, really, or even the Bible or the figure of Christ. So now with all of that, I can kind of go back, and I'm reading The Last Temptation, and I've always had a weird fascination with the experience of churches, and so that's kind of where I'm at, and I think you're kind of there as well a little bit.
I very much. I mean, we have very similar backgrounds. I was brought up Christian, also yourself deeply committed in it, but also, and I think it's fair to use this word, and it's relevant to what we were just talking about, also deeply traumatized by it. And then trying to work out right relationship to Christianity is something that I've needed to do, obviously, individually. But it's also resonant with, I don't know quite what this refers to, but the West's relationship, the commonwealth that came out of Christendom, like it still has some relationship, deep relationship to the cultural cognitive grammar of Christianity, and trying to work out what that is.
Very quickly, even if it's not traumatizing, even if the transmission and the discipline is not traumatizing, the absence of the working through trauma in relationship to some sort of spiritual framework is in itself the guarantor of the transmission of the trauma of the past, because we are almost all of us the descendants of countless wars and awful things that happened in social contexts where there was no possibility of releasing that trapped energy.
I think that's well said. The idea that we have built many patterns, complex patterns of interaction, both intrapsychically and interpersonally, and this is sort of a naturalistic version of karma, if you will, that sort of permeate and self-perpetuate through us and through our culture and our relationship to each other and our relationship to the environment. I mean, we are experiencing the trauma, that we've traumatized the environment, and that's now coming back to us in deeply powerful ways. So I think I'm in deep agreement with your interjection. I think it's very, very important. I think what's interesting is if we could put the two of these together, or at least sorry, I'm going to propose this. Because what was happening between us a few minutes ago was, I see that as very much the heritage from Socrates, that idea of discourse as a way of adducing, drawing out, of trying to, like the magic eye, see through and try to realize the logos that's occurring between us in what you're saying and possibly in what I'm saying. But I direct more attention to what you're saying. And how that could perhaps be reintegrated with the attempt to come into right relationship with Jesus as a sage and Christianity as a cultural historical phenomena. Because I think we're facing the same thing. We have to try and draw out that's how I used to use the word salvage, but I'm now moving more towards this idea of adducing, trying to draw out from Christianity in a Socratic fashion what can be drawn out in a way that is integrated with trying to deal with both the personal and the collective trauma and the legacies of trauma. And that's a very, very tricky thing to do, because, and we can see secular versions of this throughout the culture. Christianity valorizes the traumatized individual. At the center of Christianity is the cross, which is a deep trauma induction device. I mean, it's designed to tear and humiliate a person. It's designed, you don't just kill a person on the cross, you traumatize them to death, right? And so Christianity can too readily valorize the trauma as opposed to responding to the trauma. And we can get into worshiping the victim rather than dealing with trauma. And those are not the same thing. Those are not the same thing. And so trying to do this Socratic deduction of Christianity and break free from the two worlds mythology is also bound up with like really wrestling with the difficult relationship that Christianity has to trauma, precisely because it valorizes and worships the traumatized individual, the victim. It can most effectively mask and blind us to actually dealing with trauma. Because it has us look so deeply at it. It's like the magic eye picture. All we can see is the little picture. We're fascinated, and we don't actually get how we're supposed to see through it and deal with it. And so
the thing that's so close to you that you can't see it.
Yes. It's like Nietzsche's idea of the shadow that you can't jump over. Or what Nietzsche, in fact, said of Socrates. He said, I hate Socrates. He's so close to me. I'm always fighting him. And so that's the sort of thing. I don't hate Christianity, but Christianity is so close to me, I'm always fighting it in that hopefully respectful and joyful way, precisely because, and this is something that's, I mean, thank you, Jacob. You're really taking me to sort of the cutting edge of my own reflection right now, so I appreciate that. I want to genuinely thank you for that.
Yeah.
Right, but this is where I'm at right now. But really trying to understand, right, exactly what you're saying. That the affordance of anagoge. I'll represent these with what you did, the up and down, and then the dealing with trauma. They're inseparably bound together, and we have a traumatized relationship with Christianity, but it's made especially problematic because of the way trauma is actually valorized in Christianity in a symbolic way. I'm not saying that Christianity is masochistic or sadistic. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there was, I think Girard is right, there's a profound understanding there of our tendencies to scapegoat and project our trauma and all that. But it can be so lost because Christianity has made this so familiar and like it's an odd thing that people wear crosses around their necks, and they've lost how odd this is. Imagine if someone carried around a chain that had a guillotine on it. We'd go, whoa, what's wrong with you? That's weird. And then say, well, that's the relationship of what I hold most, that's a symbol of what I hold most sacred. We'd go, oh no. Mm-hmm. But we've lost all of that in the cross.
There's so many more pieces. We're going to have to talk about it again at some point, but just to bring a couple of them to bear, I think what's becoming salient to me is like the way of approaching the character of Christ or the scripture, for me, has to be done in the same way as one would approach a work of literature. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence we have this great lineage of like literary adaptations of the underlying meaning structures in the story, Lord of the Rings, so forth. And this induces a more interpretive mode of understanding, which is, and I think the other key component, which kind of Zach is talking a little bit about and has you know, kind of comes out of the kind of psychedelic Terence McKenna lineage for me as well, is about the primacy of experience, and the key, one of the key sort of axioms of making community work meaningfully is going to be that the individuals who constitute the community are themselves capable of leaving it, going out and being on their own in solitude, getting direct relationship to world, and then, you know, coming back in. But there has to be that sort of, and that's really speaks to that experience that I was having in the Orthodox churches. It's like, you know, because of how much I've kind of opened myself up, I'm getting a lot more walking down the street and observing day-to-day life than I am inside of the temple. The temple is kind of like a big, you know, some days I quite enjoy it and I find it contemplative, but very often it feels like a bit of a trick almost. Like it's like not, it's
Well,
kind of
let's draw those two things together. So Tolkien and the recovery theory, right? And so I think this is very much, so Tolkien had an idea that there's two types of fantasy. There's escapism, which, you know, and entertainment and whatever, right? And then he had what he called his recovery theory. And the idea is very much like what happens when an anthropologist goes to another culture and has to go through the difficult process of enculturating. And then the point is not just to see that other culture. That point is very important. It's a dialogical point. It's not to create a treatise or a monograph. The point is, and then when you return to this culture, you see your culture of birth from the eyes of the other culture, and you see it and you recover it. You have an insight into it in a way you didn't. And going into a church should be like that. It should be like, and I mean this respectfully, it should be an enacted fantasy that, right, makes it possible for you to go out into the street and recover that world more powerfully. I think in that sense, religious practice is very much like augmented reality, like, you know, the heads-up display of the pilot, or when people are playing Pokemon on their phones and it's getting, like we create a kind of imaginal pretense, but not because it's false or entertaining. What it does is it actually takes us out of the familiar so that we can recover the familiar with unfamiliar eyes, and we can see it more deeply, more profoundly. I think the point of going to church is exactly what happens when you leave the church, not what's happening in the church. I teach my students the exact same thing in meditation. Right? Don't think of meditation as a vacation. Think of it as an education, an educing, right? And coming out of your seated practice is an integral part of your practice. You're trying to carry over metaphor, transfer over what you've cultivated in your sitting to your everyday consciousness, cognition, character, and communitas. It's that recovery. That's the point of it. I sometimes call this the trans world. You're not moving between worlds. You're going into a fantasy in order to more deep, and I mean this again powerfully in Corbin's sense, an imaginal thing, so that you can more deeply return to this world in its depths.
And this is the correct understanding of how to relate to the mystical experience, I think. And it's also, you know, bringing in the literary component. It's Frodo leaves the Shire, goes on this epic journey, but at some point there's like the return to the Shire, but the Shire is not the same as before he went on the journey.
That's right. It's and he's not the same either.
But right now we've left the Shire, and now we're just saying like, oh, none of that, you know, the last 2,000 years, don't worry about any of that. We're over it.
Well, we have left the Shire and we haven't. We're still enmeshed, like we were talking about earlier, in a lot of ways. But yeah, I like, if we could, I really think, I would really like to put you into contact with Paul Vanderklay and get you to go on his show and have a discussion with him. I think he'd be very interested in having a discussion with you.
I've been thinking about reaching out to him, so that's right.
Well, if you'd like to, you know, once this video is available, and then I can use it as a link and introduce you to him, and I think he'd be very interested in talking to you. Jacob, I have to go soon, but a couple things. I would like to, since you've recorded this as video, I'd like to upload this to my channel as well, Voices with Vervaeke. So if you could send me the files, that would be great. And secondly, I'd like to request to have another discussion with you because I found this one really powerful. And you have a very penetrating mind, and I would like to, and I mean this again in a complimentary fashion, I'd like to play with you more about it because I think it's really, well, like I said, it's really educing. I feel very much there's a lot resonating between us. I'd like to explore it more.
It's a real honor to hear those words from you, John. Thank you.
Well, the honor is yours. Unfortunately, like I say, I do have to go, and I want to thank you. But let's set up and let's talk again soon, like within 2 or 3 weeks, if possible. If you can give me these files somehow, because I really enjoyed what happened here, and I'd like it to be more widely available to my listeners. I guess that's who are viewers. And then also, if I have that link, I want to connect you up with Paul because I think it would be lovely if you had a conversation with him.
Great. Yeah, I'll get all of that to you, and it's really good. It feels like we're just like arriving at something that needs to be opened up.
We're going to follow this up. Yeah, that's also another reason why I'd like to get a copy of this because I want to watch it again, and then you and I meet again and try and get back into the momentum of this and try and really explore this because, and I meant what I said earlier. I always try to say what I mean or mean what I say, but you were really taking me sort of to the threshold of where I'm thinking right now, the threshold, the liminal area, right? And so I want to get back there again, and I foresee that I need your help in doing so. So I would appreciate that.
Awesome, John. It's been great to have you on. It'd be good to have you on again, or I'll be on your channel or something, but we'll work it out. And
yeah, maybe well, let's get this one up onto Voices with Vervaeke, and maybe I'll send you the link next time, and then I'll directly record it, and we can upload it there as well. That's a good idea. In fact, let's make that our plan of action going forward.
The more viewers, the merrier. So.
Yeah. You understand, of course, and I don't think this is. Well, it's obviously biasing in some way, but I think right now it's also a heuristic. It's a helpful heuristic. There's a deep similarity between our respective paths that's very helpful for getting into sort of philia, that the appropriate kind of intimacy for dialectic. So, I look forward to talking to you again.
Right. Next time we'll talk about the horrors of Christian rock music and.
Yeah, okay. Take good care. A great pleasure meeting you. Great pleasure.
Likewise, John. Really great.